the exact day your life would end. Final moments of the condemned, those whose fates were sealed in May 2025. From the haunting details of their crimes to their final meals and chilling last words, we dive deep into the lives of men who spent their final days staring down the clock. What goes through a person's mind when time is running out and justice is closing in. Stay with us as we explore the stories that led them to the execution chamber. On May 1st, 2025, after spending more than 2 decades on death row, Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection in Florida. His case marked the end of a long and haunting chapter in American criminal justice, one that began with a crime so disturbing it left a community in shock and a family shattered beyond repair. In this video, we'll take you inside that final day, Hutchinson's last meal, his final words, and the moments leading up to the execution. But to understand how he ended up here, we need to go back to one quiet night in 1998 when everything changed. It was September 11th in Crestview, Florida. A peaceful suburban neighborhood was about to become the backdrop of an unthinkable tragedy. Inside a modest home, 4 lives were taken in an act so cold, so calculated, it still echoes through courtrooms and memories to this day. The victims, a young mother and her 3 children, taken in an instant without warning. But this wasn't the work of a stranger or a faceless intruder. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who lived among them. That someone was Jeffrey Hutchinson. He wasn't just a house guest. He was a decorated former Army Ranger who had served in the Gulf War. At the time, he was living with his girlfriend, Renee Flaherty, and her 3 children, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan. To outsiders, they seemed like a picture-perfect blended family. Hutchinson treated the kids as if they were his own. He played with them, helped raise them, and appeared devoted to Renee. There were no obvious signs of danger, no reports of violence, no whispers of trouble. If anything dark was brewing beneath the surface, Hutchinson kept it hidden until that night. At 7 p.m., Renee made a casual call to a friend. She sounded upbeat. Hutchinson was home, even chiming in cheerfully in the background. Everything seemed fine, but by 7:30, the mood had shifted. Renee called another friend. This time, her voice cracked with emotion. "We had a fight," she said. Her words were shaky. When asked how bad it was, she hesitated, then admitted it was serious. Hutchinson had packed some clothes, taken his guns, and stormed out of the house. "He's gone," she said, thinking it was over. But it wasn't. Instead of leaving town, Hutchinson headed to a nearby bar, a familiar spot where he and Renee were well known. But this wasn't a casual visit. He drank heavily, vented to the bartender, and told anyone who'd listen that he and Renee had just had a blowout. Still, he insisted they just needed some time apart. But as the night wore on, it became clear Hutchinson wasn't cooling off. He was unraveling. But Jeffrey Hutchinson didn't drive off into the night. Instead, he climbed back into his truck, a loaded Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun resting beside him, and headed straight back home. Less than an hour after the argument that sent him storming out, Hutchinson walked through the front door of the house where 3 children were still awake and opened fire. His first target was Renee. One fatal shot to the head ended her life instantly. Then, with chilling calculation, he moved through the house room by room, searching for the children he had once tucked in, played with, and called family. He found Jeffrey Jr. first, the oldest at just 9 years old. A blast to the chest knocked him down, but he clung to life. Hutchinson stood over the boy and fired again. This time, a shot to the head. Next was Amanda, only 7, and then Logan, just 4. Both were killed with single shotgun blasts that ended their short lives in an instant. When the violence was over, Hutchinson picked up the phone and dialed 911. In a flat, emotionless voice, he told the operator, "I just shot my family." When officers arrived, they found him sitting calmly in the garage, phone still in hand, the call still connected. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply stood and surrendered. Inside the home, officers discovered the aftermath of a calculated massacre. Renee, Amanda, and Logan were found together in a bedroom. Jeffrey Jr.'s body lay alone in the living room. At first, Hutchinson spun a story, claiming two masked men had broken in and murdered the family while he escaped, but the evidence dismantled that lie. Gunshot residue covered Hutchinson's hands. Shotgun shells were left on the kitchen counter. Tissue from young Jeffrey's body was found on Hutchinson's clothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing to support a break-in. The truth was clear. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was the man who had lived among them. To understand how Hutchinson became capable of something so horrific, we have to look back at his life before that night. Born on November 6th, 1962, in Florida, Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson grew up in a large, boisterous household with several siblings. His childhood wasn't marked by abuse or extreme trauma, at least not publicly. Diagnosed with ADHD early on, he struggled with attention in school, but was otherwise described as a relatively normal kid. After high school, he drifted from job to job, working as a mechanic and later as a security guard. Employers saw him as dependable. He showed up, did his work, and kept a low profile. Then came the military. Hutchinson trained as a paratrooper and eventually earned a place among the U.S. Army Rangers, one of the nation's most elite fighting units. He was deployed overseas and served in the Gulf War, including in Operation Desert Storm. For many, it was a time of service and honor. For Hutchinson, it may have been the beginning of an unraveling that no one saw coming. Jeffrey Hutchinson served in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. But the man who returned was not the same one who had gone off to war. His family noticed it before he ever spoke a word. He was quieter, angrier, restless in a way that didn't fade with time. Sleep rarely came, and when it didn't, the alcohol did. The Army eventually gave him an honorable discharge, but civilian life offered no healing. His first marriage fell apart, and his second didn't last long either. Whatever followed him home from the battlefield, it stayed, and it festered. Then came Renee Flaherty, a 32-year-old single mother trying to build something stable for herself and her 3 children. She worked hard and kept her world steady. When she met Jeffrey, it seemed like a fresh start. They eventually moved together from Washington to Florida, and for a time, about a year and a half, things looked good on the surface. But beneath that calm, something inside Jeffrey Hutchinson was unraveling. And on the night of September 11th, 1998, it snapped completely. After the murders, Hutchinson's story kept shifting. At first, he said he had blacked out from drinking. Later, he called it a crime of passion, something unplanned, something that just happened in the heat of the moment. But when his trial began in early 2001, prosecutors weren't convinced. His defense team pushed back hard. They argued that Hutchinson was a man haunted by war, suffering from untreated mental illness and years of alcohol abuse. Expert witnesses claimed he was bipolar and not in control of his actions the night of the killings. But the jury wasn't swayed, and neither was the judge. In a written ruling, the court stated that there was no meaningful connection between Hutchinson's military-related diagnoses and the cold, deliberate execution of a woman and 3 children. After 9 days of testimony, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all 4 counts of murder. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Hutchinson's military service and clean criminal record. That, he said, spared him a death sentence for killing Renee. Instead, Hutchinson received life in prison for her murder. But for the children, for Jeffrey Jr., Amanda, and Logan, there was no leniency. Because of how young and defenseless they were, the court determined that justice demanded the maximum penalty. Hutchinson was sentenced to death 3 times over, 1 for each child. He was transferred to Florida's death row, where he remained for over 2 decades. Appeal after appeal followed. Hutchinson's legal team argued that the trial was flawed, that his mental health had not been fully considered, and that the death penalty was too severe in his case. But every court came to the same conclusion: the sentence would stand. The crimes were too brutal, too deliberate, too devastating. After 26 years on death row, Jeffrey Hutchinson's execution was scheduled for May 1st, 2025. For his final meal, he requested salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, a baked potato, and iced tea. That day, he was visited by 3 people, including his sister and a spiritual advisor. As the sun set, he was escorted into Florida's death chamber and strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, he offered none. But as the procedure began, witnesses reported seeing his lips moving, softly, silently, perhaps whispering a final prayer, or speaking to someone only he could hear. The state used lethal injection. His legs trembled, and his body spasmed for several minutes before going still. At 8:15 p.m., Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was pronounced dead. He was 62 years old. On May 15th, 2025, at Florida State Prison, after spending more than 2 decades on death row, Glenn Edward Rogers was executed by lethal injection in Florida. His case marked the end of a long and haunting chapter in American criminal justice. Glenn Edward Rogers, born in 1962, Rogers earned a notorious reputation during the 1990s, when a cross-country killing spree ultimately led to his conviction and death sentences in both Florida and California. But that's only
Channel 9
part of the
videographer
story.
Chick Poppy
The media dubbed him
the question
the
on
Casanova
everyone's
Killer,
mind tonight.
a reference to the infamous Venetian lover from the 1700s, known for his charm and conquests. And like the original Casanova, Rogers had a way with women, using his good looks, confidence, and flashy spending to draw them in. But behind the charm was a predator. While officially convicted of 2 murders, Rogers claimed responsibility for as many as 70 killings across the United States. Among those
Moments
confessions
later, as he was
an
transferred
explosive
to another
claim
trooper's
that
car,
he,
I
not
asked
O.J.
an angry
Simpson,
Glenn
was
Rogers the
responsible
same
for the
question again.
1994 murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. In one version of his story, Rogers said he had been romantically fixated on Nicole, but after she rejected him, he retaliated with violence. In another, he claimed he was hired by O.J. Simpson to break into her home and recover jewelry, only killing her and Goldman when they unexpectedly appeared. Authorities, however, dismissed these confessions, standing by their original findings and charges against Simpson. Still, what is undeniable is the terror Rogers inflicted in a short span of time. Between September and November of 1995, he murdered 4 women in 4 different states, all within just 6
dragging
weeks.
him out
He was
moments
cunning,
later at
but not
gunpoint.
exactly discreet. Rogers often used his real name when checking into motels. He even drove his victims' cars around for weeks after their deaths. His casual attitude made him harder to track, not because he was in hiding, but because he moved so freely and brazenly that few suspected the danger he posed. How did he slip through the cracks? What drove him to kill? And how many lives did he really take? In the fall of 1995, Glenn Rogers' trail of terror moved west to the Van Nuys area of Los Angeles.
Dragging him out moments
Sandra
later at
Gallagher,
gunpoint.
a married mother of 3 who was going through a rocky separation from her husband. Seeking a break from her troubles, Sandra went out for drinks with friends. That night, she crossed paths with Rogers. Charming and generous, he paid for Sandra's drinks and her friends, quickly winning her trust. By the end of the night, Rogers told Sandra he needed a ride home. She agreed, and they left together in her blue pickup truck. It was the last time she'd be seen alive. The next morning, hospital staff in the area noticed smoke rising from a nearby parking lot. A witness arriving early for her shift spotted a man with long blonde hair and a beard dousing the blue pickup truck in flames before fleeing on foot. Once the fire was extinguished, the horror became clear. Sandra's lifeless, badly burned body was discovered inside, but the fire hadn't killed her. The coroner later confirmed what investigators feared. She had been strangled to death before the flames ever touched her. Tracing Sandra's final hours, detectives went to the bar she'd visited the night before. Staff there remembered the man vividly. He'd been a regular over the past few days and introduced himself as Glenn Rogers. When police searched Rogers' nearby apartment, they found personal items belonging to Sandra Gallagher. His name was immediately added to a nationwide wanted database, but by then, Glenn Rogers had already vanished, and he wasn't done. Just weeks later, over 2,000 miles away in Jackson, Mississippi, Rogers resurfaced at the Mississippi State Fair, where he found work and met 34-year-old Linda Price, a single mother of two. Their whirlwind relationship escalated quickly. With nowhere to stay, Rogers moved into Linda's apartment. At first, things seemed normal, but Linda soon noticed red flags. Rogers had a violent temper that only worsened with alcohol. Concerned for her safety, she confided in her family that she planned to ask him to leave. That conversation would be her last warning. On October 31st, 1995, Halloween night, Linda's family arrived at her home for a planned gathering. What they found instead was a nightmare. Linda had been stabbed to death and left in her bathtub. When detectives questioned the family, they all pointed to the same man, Glenn Rogers. They knew him by name, and they knew Linda had planned to remove him from her life. When his name was entered into law enforcement databases, investigators discovered what they feared. Glenn Rogers was already wanted for murder in California. Now, with a second woman dead and a cross-country fugitive on the loose, the manhunt for Glenn Rogers was no longer a local search. It had become a national emergency. Just 5 days after the brutal murder in Van Nuys, California, Glenn Rogers resurfaced, this time in Tampa, Florida. It was at a local bar that Rogers met 34-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs. The two shared drinks and casual conversation, and by the end of the evening, Rogers asked Tina for a ride back to his motel. She agreed. Tina drove a white Ford Festiva. The following morning, something odd happened. Rogers walked into the motel office and paid for an extra night, but soon after, the motel manager saw him loading his bags into Tina's white car and driving away. The scene felt off. Why pay for another night if he planned to leave? Rogers had also made a strange request. He didn't want anyone entering his room, not even housekeeping. But when checkout time came, and the Do Not Disturb sign was still hanging on the door, motel staff grew suspicious. Following protocol, a maid entered the room to clean. Inside the bathroom, she made a horrifying discovery. Tina Marie Cribbs was found lifeless in the bathtub. She had been stabbed to death. Investigators quickly tied the room rental to Glenn Rogers. His pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Charm, lure, kill, and then vanish. Detectives also noted a chilling detail. Rogers' victims often turned up in bathtubs. Authorities theorized he may have used running water in an attempt to wash away forensic evidence, his own twisted version of a cover-up. By now, the FBI had joined the hunt. Rogers was officially listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, and his name spread like wildfire through national headlines. But Rogers wasn't done. After fleeing Florida, he traveled to Bossier City, Louisiana. where he reunited with a woman named Andy Giles Sutton. One report suggests they may have known each other previously. Andy had told friends she was happy to see him again. Glenn Rogers didn't stay hidden for long. Just days after the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs in Florida, Rogers resurfaced in Bossier City, Louisiana, where he reconnected with Andy Giles Sutton, a woman he may have known from the past. Andy had told her friends how happy she was to see him again, but that joy would turn to tragedy. Late one night, Andy's roommate came home and heard the couple in their shared bedroom. Rather than disturb them, she decided to sleep on the couch. The next morning, after hearing nothing from the room, she knocked gently on the door. There was no answer. She opened it and made a horrifying discovery. Andy was lying on the bed, brutally slashed and lifeless. When investigators questioned the roommate, she identified Andy's new boyfriend by name, Glenn Rogers. By this point, the manhunt for Rogers had become national. The FBI had zeroed in on Kentucky, suspecting he might attempt to contact family there. They were right. 4 days after Andy's murder, a family member in Kentucky dialed 911. Rogers had just visited her home, she said, and she provided police with the direction he was headed, along with the vehicle description, a small white car, which authorities knew had belonged to Tina Marie Cribbs. Soon after, a Kentucky State Police trooper spotted the car. A high-speed chase ensued. Rogers lost control and crashed into a ditch. It was over. News crews, tipped off to the pursuit, arrived just in time to broadcast the dramatic arrest live. Inside the car, crime scene technicians recovered bloody clothing and evidence linking Rogers to all 4 murders committed during his 6-week cross-country rampage. The states involved agreed that Florida would try Rogers first. 2 years after his arrest, Glenn Rogers stood trial for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Today, he remains on Florida's death row, with his execution scheduled for May 15th of this year. Following his Florida conviction, Rogers was temporarily transferred to California, where he was tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Gallagher. There, too, he received another death sentence before being returned to Florida's death row. Other states declined to prosecute Rogers for the additional murders, since he had already received 2 death sentences. At least one report stated that Glenn Rogers left behind 11 children without their mothers, a haunting reminder of the devastation left in his wake. In Indiana, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie is scheduled for execution on May 20th. His case is particularly notable because the victim was a law enforcement officer, Officer William Toney, a 31-year-old father and husband. In 2000, Ritchie fled a stolen vehicle and was pursued on foot by Officer Toney. When cornered, Ritchie turned and fatally shot the officer, striking him just above his bulletproof vest. Ritchie's background reveals a history of abandonment, prenatal drug exposure, and serious mental illness. Still, the court ruled that these factors did not outweigh the severity of his crime. At sentencing, Officer Toney's widow directly addressed Ritchie, expressing her pain and hope that justice would prevail. Now, more than 20 years later, that moment is near. Next, we turn to Tennessee, where Oscar Franklin Smith is scheduled for execution on May 22nd. In 1989, Smith was convicted for the murders of his estranged wife, Judy Smith, and her teenage sons, Chad and Jason. The scene was gruesome. Judy was stabbed and bludgeoned, while the boys suffered devastating injuries. A neighbor heard one of them cry out, "Frank, no," during the attack. Although Smith was originally scheduled for execution in 2022, a procedural oversight delayed it. Tennessee's governor temporarily halted all executions that year. Now, with revised procedures, Smith's case has returned to the schedule. Lastly, we revisit Tennessee for Harold Wayne Nichols, whose case dates back to 1988. Nichols was convicted in the sexual assault and murder of Karen Pulley, a 21-year-old woman targeted because of her vulnerability. His execution has been postponed multiple times, including due to the COVID-19 pandemic. For Karen's family, the wait has been long and emotionally draining. One relative recently said, "It's been 35 years, and nothing has changed." Nichols's case is expected to reach resolution by the end of 2025. These 5 men, Hutchinson, Rogers, Ritchie, Smith, and Nichols, represent more than just names on a list. Behind each case are families who've waited years, even decades, for justice. Some feel that these executions bring a measure of closure. Others question whether this approach truly serves the goals of justice or simply continues a cycle of pain. Supporters of the current system argue that failing to carry out these sentences devalues the lives lost. Critics point to complex factors like mental illness, childhood trauma, and the risk, however small, of wrongful conviction. These executions don't happen in isolation. Each involves correctional staff, legal officials, and medical personnel who must carry out the orders, often at great psychological cost. Meanwhile, nationwide support for capital punishment is shifting. Some states have abolished it altogether. Others struggle to obtain the necessary materials, as pharmaceutical companies increasingly refuse to supply drugs for this purpose. As we reflect on these stories, we're left with important questions. Is this justice, or is it time for a new approach? Do these conclusions offer peace, or just prolong the pain? The answers aren't simple, but for these 5 men, time is running out. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if there are other cases you want us to explore, let us know. We're just getting started.